safety that is necessary. And certainly also for those who deal with this issue every day, to find a way to help survivors regain economic independence. In many of our small islands, it is a challenge that I think is very little understood by those who have the great luxury of living in a more populous society. And so I want to particularly congratulate the perseverance and determination of those of you who have to every day deal with this challenge and find solutions. We invite you all to review the guidelines which can be found on the UNFPA Caribbean website, and as Mariana has said, we really invite your feedback and comments. These guidelines, in addition to the ESP-COP, will provide another tool for us to address the issue of GBV and provide the type of care and support that is needed for survivors. Thank you all, and to the press, I'm happy to answer any questions, if they are any.
Thank you, Alison. And at this point, I'd like to invite Anne-Marie Williams to give us a brief statement from CARICOM.
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, everyone. The past 2 days, if we look back and we are really honest, has been very inspirational, very eye-opening. The Essential Services Package Community of Practice happens to be an opportunity for all of us in CARICOM, particularly all 15 full members and 5 associate member states, some of whom you all are represented here today. It's an opportunity because our region is particularly prone to disasters and emergencies. While ESP-COP is not necessarily something for an emergency or in times of disaster, and it's something that we want to make the order of the day when we talk about treating with gender-based violence, we also have to think what we do when an emergency comes, because it's not if, it's just when. And in our group this morning, when we shared St. Vincent and the Grenadines was actually the perfect picture of what can happen when we have multiple and intersecting forms of emergencies. Because their particular example stuck with me. During the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, laissez-faire actually erupted, and we all know what happened then. They had floods, and there was an outbreak of dengue. So that's 4 emergencies, multiple emergencies. What do? You can't treat one and not treat the other. And my colleague from St. Vincent made it clear that despite some of their workers or some of their volunteers had training, after months, you stretch thin. And after stretching thin, we know what happens. You don't get the best service and the best care. And try as you may, the time is very long. And so that made me realize that while we want the Essential Service Package Community of Practice for an everyday thing, we have to ramp up in times of emergency. And we actually thought about getting a database together, and if we could switch and cross over member states when absolutely necessary in times of an emergency. We all know right now that if there's an emergency in a particular member state, the electric company would send their technicians, the Defense Force would send their soldiers, and the community of the ESP-COP can be sent also. And so we thought about that this morning, and it is not something that we want to do every day and just forget in times of an emergency. What I'm sure that we want to do at CARICOM is to really pledge our support, and with your help, ensure that we make the ESP COP sustainable. I know we will have a challenge where funding is concerned, because that was also spoken about this morning, but we have to try to advocate and see how best we can get funding, particularly for those countries that really have started the ESP COP without spotlight funding. So on behalf of my colleague in education and in crime and security, while the gender program will take the lead on this, we need to rely on them, because it is not for one person, but our collective efforts will take us through. So on behalf of Dr. Slater, who left this morning, and Laurette and Sherwin, accept our support. We'll be doing the heavy lifting, but it will not be so heavy because you will be with us. And we pledge to make it work for the millions of girls and children, the millions of girls and women, and some children also who will be depending on us. So I want to thank UNFPA for the opportunity, and thank the EU, and thank all of you for showing up. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anne-Marie, and thank you to Alison, both for giving us statements. And at this time, I would like to invite the media. If you have any questions, now would be the time. I ask that you just state your name and the media house you represent. Any questions? Yes? So we do also have Mariana Santoyo, gender-based violence and regional program specialist, who can answer any technical questions that you may have as well.
Yeah, hi. Sonal Lala from TDT News. Just a couple of questions from me. I was not here for the remainder of what you all had. I just arrived, so I'm just trying to get up to brief. But I know you would have talked about some of the guidelines. Can you just briefly discuss what are those and what would have come out of that? And I know recently the wife of Prime Minister, Dr. Keith Rowley down here, would have talked about, his wife would have talked about bringing gender-based violence, having it being taught in schools and so on. Any remarks, and did this take part of any discussions over the last few days? Yeah.
Would you like to take this? All right, I'll invite Mariana to take the response for this one.
Thank you for your questions. And to answer your first question, we have a lot of guidelines that we discussed during this meeting. The main one, which is called the Essential Services Package, that's the main one, which comes along with the name, right? So this is some guidelines that were created in 2013 by different UN agencies, including UNFPA, UN Women, UNDP, and it's basically setting out the minimum or the essential services that have to be in place by different sectors of work: health, justice and police, social services, and coordination and governance, in order to support survivors of gender-based violence. We also discussed the interagency gender-based violence in emergencies minimum standards, which are additional guidelines which were launched in 2019 by the Gender-Based Violence Global Area of Responsibility, which is composed by all the UN agencies and INGOs around the world. And it's basically setting minimum standards for the response to gender-based violence in emergencies. Sorry, I'm losing my voice already. And it's basically minimum actions, minimum activities that you need to put in place for during an emergency, during preparedness, or during the response to an emergency. And the last guidelines were the guidelines for the setup and management of safe shelters for survivors of GBV, safe houses for a survivor whose for example, experiencing intimate partner violence and they want to leave their home. So guidelines for organizations who provide this kind of service. In terms of education, and I would love my colleagues from UNICEF to be here with us as well with supporting CARICOM, we are in the early stages of trying to include the sector of education into the essential services package, because from the beginning it was not a part of it, but we do recognize in the community of practice that it is a big gap and we want to work towards it. So CARICOM, in support with the support from UNICEF, is developing an assessment of the education sector so that we can together identify in which way we can, include this sector into the essential services package and have, a comprehensive response to gender-based violence in schools, even universities and, the education sector as a whole.
Yes. Yeah. Just a follow-up from me in terms of some of these guidelines. Is it being shared? Has any discussions being had with the individual ministries of the region and so on? And finally, there's always the discussion of when gender-based violence comes up, questions with the police and so on. When some of these victims go to the police, they are not recognized, and it's too late when it comes down to that. Was any of that discussed? Any guidelines on that as well?
Yes. So I'll start with the police one. We actually, this is the point of this meeting here, and we have CARICOM's representative for the justice and police services and system, right, sector. And so the idea with this community of practice is that we together identify the gaps. We're conducting a regional study around the services that are being provided, the implementation of these essential services, how we are in each country, so that we can provide recommendations. And one of the big gaps that we have identified in the whole region is capacity building, which also touches in the areas of police. As we know, police can be a safe haven for survivors, but it could also be a risk. So we do count with the presence of the justice and police sector at the regional level in this meeting, and the idea is to work closely with them at the national level. This is mainly being spearheaded by UNDP, which is another UN sister agency for us. We also have our colleague here present today. So as you see, it's multi-sectoral, multi-agency, everybody's here together trying to figure out how to better provide services for survivors. And in terms of communication and these guidelines and the communications with the ministries and the governments, it's basically up to all of them to go back to their governments and advocate for the use of these guidelines. We do have 5 countries in the region who are already in the process of implementing the essential services package. We have 15 countries who are not implementing it, but they also struggle to get funding for this. So we are also trying to figure out ways on how to support them to fundraise, to be able to implement the ESP based on the lessons learned from other countries. So it's an exchange of knowledge and experiences and good practices and challenges that can serve all the countries in the region to be able to implement the essential services package. And also, all the persons present here, the heads of the gender affairs units, they were sent here also with the permission and the endorsement, not the permission, the endorsement of their respective ministries. So we hope that this is also a sign of their involvement and their engagement with this initiative.
And just finally for me, any statistics regarding regionally, that is, regarding the number of victims that there have been? I know statistics is always a difficult thing to get on the number of victims, but regionally, is there any pre-pandemic figures as opposed to post-pandemic? And
Sorry, I'm not able to hear you very well.
Oh, sorry.
Can you repeat?
So
There,
any statistics regarding the number of victims, how much has it increased since in terms of regionally pre-pandemic as opposed to the present?
Well, I'm going to ask also my colleague Anne-Marie to respond to this question, but I would just like to say one thing in terms of data. And we have discussed this widely during this meeting, and is that the number of survivors does not say anything about the prevalence or the incidence, right? Because we know that the majority of survivors, the big majority, do not report. They don't go to services because they're afraid, because the services are not adequate for them, right? So we need to slowly, in the conversations that we're having and also with you, the media, to help us step away from this need that we have to get numbers of survivors, because this is not really a comprehensive view, it's just the tip of the iceberg, right? But either ways, I'm sorry, we have had we do have some statistics that my colleague Anne-Marie is going to talk about. Thank you.
Thank you, Mariana. The data I'll speak about happens to be pre-pandemic, because during the pandemic, there's been some assessments done following the pandemic, but you would know also that the assessments were not comparative, so to speak, but what I can tell you that all member states reported that there were increased incidents of gender-based violence during 2020 to 2021. And that is almost a given, because pre-pandemic, let's look at pre-pandemic. For the first time in our region, there were 5 prevalence surveys done. Prevalence surveys looking at intimate partner violence. And the countries were Guyana, Grenada, Jamaica, Trinidad, and Suriname. So 5 countries. And while the global figures show you that 1 in 3 women will be affected by gender-based violence during her lifetime, the figures in the region actually mirror that and are a bit worse, because Trinidad, Jamaica, Suriname, and Grenada, for the most part, registered like 1 in 3. But for Guyana, it was a sad 1 in 2. And it showed you that upwards of 80% happened to be perpetrators. So 80% of the perpetrators were men. So that's pre-pandemic. So imagine how bad it got when women were forced to shelter in place with their abusers during the lockdown. And that went on for, as you know, almost 2 years. While the lockdown was on for 2 years, a lot of pressures also happened to have exacerbated GBV. A number of people lost their jobs. Economic pressures really contributed to violence in the home, violence in some of the workplaces. And that's really where we are. Some of the countries had some numbers, but like I said, the numbers are not comparable. So we've done different assessments. The assessments also show you too that the different types of household, low, medium, and upper middle income household lost income during that time. These are all factors that will impact on gender-based violence within and outside the home. So that's good. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne-Marie. I invite you, if you have any more questions, to go ahead and ask them now. If not, any more questions? All right, thank you guys so much for coming. Thank you for being here to the media. And we will wrap up this segment of the proceedings now. And I invite our our persons on stage. If you would like, you can go back down to your seats. And I invite Aurora, our liaison officer for Trinidad and Tobago, to do the vote of thanks. Thank you, everyone.
Good afternoon, everyone. We've had a full 2 days of discussions on how we can support the implementation of this essential service package for survivors of gender-based violence.